Yesterday, at least from this recording's perspective, a new trailer for Tales of the Shire released, which is basically a little cozy game where you can live and do some stuff in the Shire as a hobbit, and that was announced some time ago. And now we got a new trailer, and this trailer also for the first time includes actual gameplay footage. And today I want to look a little bit into the trailer. My name is Chris, aka ThePhilosophersGames, and this time only one hint: I try to pronounce names as Tolkien described it, at least I try to, so there will be potentially some trilled R's here and there. But let us start. The first positive thing I notice is that the game has a beautiful art style, in my opinion. The aesthetic of the game is just really nice, and to me seems very distantly reminiscent of what the recent two Zelda games, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, are doing art style wise as well. It looks like it is drawn like a beautiful artwork by an artist. In this context, it seems that the night scenes are working much better in my opinion than the day scenes, and especially the interior scenes in this regard. But keep in mind, it's alpha footage. That means alpha is a very early development step of a game. It's far enough to show something, but it's not finished yet, so keep this in mind. On the other side, it seems the game comes out this year at some point, so it can't be that far away from finished anymore if you consider that we already have the end of April right now. What is somewhat noticeable is that things and objects often don't cast shadows inside of buildings, which is different outside. Also there outside, not everything casts a shadow, it seems, but there you could still argue it's kind of part of the artistic vision of this style. But inside the building it kind of looks a bit off and seems to be a bit rough just looking at the footage, which could definitely change for the release. Further, I have to admit that the water looks pretty nice, especially the reflections on it. And at first I thought it releases also on the Nintendo Switch, which is, when it comes to hardware power, not that powerful anymore. And I thought it must be Screenspace Reflections. However, on further inspection of the reflections, I think that is not the case. Screenspace Reflections are a technique where you use what you see currently on the screen, so on your screen space, to calculate the reflection on the water. But as soon as something leaves your screen space, for example, if you move the camera, you get a weird reflection behavior because it can't be part of the reflection anymore, even though you still would be able to see it in a reflection, even if it's off screen. And to do this, you usually need something like ray tracing, which is far more expensive and would potentially be available on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series, but not on a Nintendo Switch. Of course, also on PC you have ray tracing options if you have the hardware for it. So that I found very interesting, because on further inspection the water looks like it is actually ray traced, at least at times, and sometimes it looks like Screenspace Reflections or a mixture of both. So there's definitely something going on, but maybe it's a very sophisticated implementation of Screenspace and other techniques to get these reflections in the water. I also would assume that the reflections might look quite different on the Switch. Another detail I noticed immediately when I saw the trailer for the first time were that some of the animations seem to be a little bit off, especially the walking looks very strange in my opinion. Though you could argue it is intentional that the hobbits have some funny way of walking, maybe this game also has children in mind, and so on and so forth, but still, for my personal taste, it looks a little bit off, to be honest, and maybe they improve on this also further down the development. If we look at the game, it seems to be really a cozy, classic farm life sim in the likes of Harvest Moon and especially the more recent Stardew Valley, which is just such a praised and big game. And I think it also got a big update just a few days ago, and it's still worked on and has an active modding community. So for newcomers, it's always tough to compete against these classic games that are so popular in this particular genre. It was, in my opinion, very similar with the Return to Moria game, which is in of itself not a bad game at all. It's pretty good in many ways, but it's not as good as its competition, and there are so many competitors in this survival crafting co-op genre that it's tough to recommend to people who are maybe not that deep into Lord of the Rings. Of course, having the Lord of the Rings license is a selling point, but if you can't compete gameplay-wise with the big games, then your game will be forgotten pretty fast, I'm sure, except for some hardcore fans. And if that is enough for the developers, then totally fine. But from the perspective of reaching a wider audience, it is very, very difficult in some of these genres to get your foot into the door, if that makes sense. This could be very similar with this farm life sim genre. I'm not too familiar with this because it's not my genre, but I just know there are definitely some games out there that are very popular and strong here as well, and competing with those will, for a newcomer, always be tough because they exist longer. They have multiple updates that came over the years. They have had a lot of feedback by the fans, and some of these awesome developers also listen to feedback and then improve the game further and further. This is then very tough to compete with if you just released your game. I definitely hope that they can deliver a fantastic game that people like and love, and that they can compete with those other games, but in my opinion that will be insanely tough to do. If we now look further into some details that we see in the trailer and have to do with the Lord of the Rings lore, we for example see a wizard there, a man with like a pointy head. So I assume that would be Gandalf. Gandalf is the wizard that, I wouldn't say discovered the Hobbits, but kind of made them popular and intertwined them with the big events in the world. And he has a sword, and if that is his sword, which would be Glamdring, we would know that this would play after the events of The Hobbit, because he finds it in a troll cave on this adventure there in the first Tolkien book. In the description of Gandalf in The Hobbit, we can also read an old man with a staff. He had a tall, pointed blue hat, a long grey cloak, a silver scarf, over which his long white beard hung down below his waist, and immense black boots. And that kind of seems to fit what we see here in this little scene. Further in the background, we see a person holding an axe and having a beard. And usually having beards is kind of unusual among hobbits, though that might be dependent on their ancestry, but it's a complicated topic. Still, of course, dwarves are also small people and have beards, so this could potentially be a dwarf. Matt, aka Nerd of the Rings, suggests that this might even be a female dwarf, and we know that female dwarves had beards as well from two texts. There's one text you could interpret in a direction that Tolkien maybe changed his mind on this matter a bit later, but I would disagree with this interpretation, to be honest. And in the published Lord of the Rings, it is indirectly indicated that female dwarves also have beards. So it's a complicated topic. Let's not dive too deep into this. Having dwarves in the Shire, though, is not too unusual at Bilbo's time. So we already kind of said that this might play after the events of The Hobbit, potentially before the Lord of the Rings. As a result, this would make complete sense to have at some point a dwarf visiting Bilbo in the Shire, or visiting the Shire in general at times. Especially at the time when Bilbo leaves the Shire, there's also the mention that he had some dealings with some dwarves who helped him, and I think also accompanied him when he went to Rivendell. So this is, I think, a further indicator that this might be the time in which this game might play. Another interesting detail is this Hobbit female seems to have lost her leg, and she has a wooden leg instead. I think it's her right leg. And first I thought it would be a visual glitch in the trailer or something, but no, it's also on the artwork if you look very closely of this game. So it seems to be there's maybe a story behind this. You could ask now, did hobbits have wooden legs? And though in the published version, not really, at least I can't think of any, but in very early versions of some Lord of the Rings chapters that were not intended for publication, and Tolkien just worked on them, iterated them, and then made them into what we know is the Lord of the Rings today, we find a potential case, actually. And in this version, Aragorn is not a man yet, but still a hobbit, and called Trotter. Let me quote from the book Return of the Shadow. Thus it was that Frodo learned how Trotter had tracked Gollum, and he wandered southwards through Fangorn forest and past the Dead Marshes until he had himself been caught and imprisoned by the Dark Lord. "Ever since I have worn shoes," said Trotter with a shudder. And though he said no more, Frodo knew that he had been tortured and his feet hurt in some way, but he had been rescued by Gandalf and saved from death. Further, there's also a note by Christopher Tolkien, that is John Ronald Reuel's son, who published these texts posthumously. "My father bracketed the passage from 'ever since I have worn shoes' to 'hurt in some way' and wrote in the margin with a query that it should be revealed later that Trotter had wooden feet." So it seems like here we have a case of prothesis for a hobbit. And this is a reference, though I think that is very unlikely because it's such an unknown early text that I think only very few people even know about. As a result, not many people would even get the reference, and I can't imagine that they digged too deep into the writing process of The Lord of the Rings itself for research here, though if they did, my respect, but I think it's unlikely. If we now come to the end of this video, what are my impressions? I like the art style. I think it looks really gorgeous at times, though if you look at some graphic fidelity details, there is still some room for improvement, especially the lighting could use some improvement here and there, especially in the interiors. Maybe this will change over time for the full release, who knows? But this is a trailer to promote and show off what your game can do. Usually developers are very focused on having it look as good as possible, and some developers even make their games look better in trailers than the actual release, so that is also a thing. It's tough to tell how this game then will look. It releases on a wide array of hardware, so on PC over Steam, on the PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S, and also on the Nintendo Switch, which is the least powerful when it comes to hardware. And I would expect it maybe looking worse or not as good as on the other platforms on the Switch, so keep this in mind. Especially if it's really ray tracing, then you won't see that on the Switch for sure, but it's possible on the other platforms if you so desire. Further, that is just one little detail, of course. Like I said, the lighting, shadows and so on still need some work, could be done of course. Still, at the end, what counts is that the game is fun, and I can see that a lot of people just want to go fishing in the Shire and maybe next to their hobbit hole plant some tomatoes, potatoes, however they are pronounced, and have a lot of fun and a good cozy time with this. I also think it's a very decent game for the Nintendo Switch because it's a handheld, you can play it on the go, so that could be interesting and nice for some people too. So a good decision here by the publisher, Private Division, and it's developed by Weta Workshop that also worked on the Lord of the Rings films, and they have a small digital apartment for games and so on. It's not an indie title, though it looks like one for sure, and potentially at a very small budget in that regard, but since they have a big publisher with Private Division in the back, it's always tough to call those games indie games. They are not independent in this regard, because Private Division is part of Take-Two, and those also make stuff like the GTA series, so I wouldn't call them small by any means. To give you some perspective, Take-Two is currently the 8th biggest publisher on this planet as far as I'm aware, so there's that. Another detail seems to be that they don't have the license for the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings film music. That could be budget reasons, of course. It could also be an intended decision because they want to establish their own kind of vision of the Shire, not mimic the one of Peter Jackson. And if you really desire to listen to Howard Shore's music for the Lord of the Rings Peter Jackson films in the background instead of the in-game music here, you can potentially just turn off the in-game music and listen to your own music. That's always a possibility. Overall, unfortunately, they did not show us that much gameplay yet, so I still have not a very clear idea what to actually do in the game over a longer time, though this might change in the future with more trailers coming out. This was the first trailer. It's usually quite vague. There at some point might be a gameplay trailer or a story trailer, whatever, and then you learn a little bit more what's going on in the game. We will find out in the future for sure, and I hope they succeed. With this, we have the end of the video. I want to give a huge shout outs again to all the people supporting this channel here. Thank you for that. If you haven't pressed the like button, maybe do this right now, maybe subscribe, and also let me know what you think of the game in the comments. It would be much appreciated. Maybe check my other content here on the channel or my Twitch and games channel and so on if you're interested in this, because this is Lord of the Rings related. I put it here on the main channel, not on the games channel, in case you wonder. And I think that's it for today. Again, thank you for watching and see you people next time. Goodbye.